6 German soldiers spotted a figure in Soviet uniform slowly raising her hands above her head. Their laughter echoed through the autumn forest. War had given them a gift, a weary girl without weapons, with an exhausted face and trembling from weakness, seemed like the perfect trophy to report to command. But they didn't know they were making the most fatal and final mistake of their lives. The German servicemen were patrolling a section of forest in the area of a Soviet breakthrough. Their task was to identify and detain stragglers from the Red Army who were escaping encirclement in small groups or alone. The work was considered routine and safe, as demoralized, hungry, often unarmed Soviet soldiers rarely offered serious resistance. Over 3 days of patrolling, the group had detained 18 people without firing a single shot. Each new detention reinforced their confidence in their own invulnerability and superiority. When a short figure in a field shirt appeared through the birch grove, the Germans didn't even ready their weapons. The girl walked, swaying, clearly at the limit of her physical strength. Her uniform was crumpled and covered with dirt, her hair disheveled, her boots worn to holes. Complete submission to fate was written on her face. Her gaze was extinguished, her shoulders dropped. One of the soldiers joked something in his language, the others laughed. They saw before them another prisoner who would be grateful for a piece of bread and the chance to stay alive. The patrol commander gestured for 2 men to approach closer and check the prisoner for weapons. The rest relaxed and watched what was happening, lowering their submachine guns. In their minds, the war was already over for this girl. She had surrendered, raised her hands, demonstrated all signs of capitulation. None of the 6 could imagine that the trained instincts of professional soldiers were failing them catastrophically. No one noticed the strange discrepancy between the prisoner's outward weakness and the perfect control of her breathing. No one paid attention to how precisely and confidently she maintained balance, despite the demonstrative swaying. The occupiers had no idea that this fragile-looking girl was Svetlana Potemkina, a fighter in a legendary reconnaissance unit recognized as one of the best masters of hand-to-hand combat among women of the Red Army. They didn't know that over 2 years of war, she had completed more than 50 drops behind enemy lines, each time returning alive thanks to her unique mastery of weaponless combat. They didn't know that her hands, which seemed so weak and harmless, had been honed by thousands of hours of training into a state of perfect weaponry. They didn't know that now they were walking toward their own fate, mistaking a she-wolf for a sheep. The distance between the patrol and the girl was closing. The Germans moved without particular caution. Their movements were relaxed, almost careless. An atmosphere of the mundane hung in the air. Another prisoner, another entry in the log, another interrogation at headquarters. The autumn wind stirred the yellowed leaves on the trees, creating a soft, rustling background. Sunbeams broke through the crowns, creating a bizarre play of light and shadow on the forest floor. Nature remained indifferent to the drama that was about to unfold. 2 German soldiers approached Potemkina almost point blank. One of them extended his hand to search the prisoner. The other held a submachine gun at the ready, but purely formally, barrel down. The other 4 stood at a distance, watching the scene with lazy curiosity. Someone took out a flask and took a sip of water. Someone lit a cigarette. The atmosphere was so relaxed that it seemed as if they were somewhere in a safe rear area, not in a frontline zone. The patrol commander was already imagining how he would report another successful detention, another number for the statistics, another checkmark in the report. Perhaps this girl would even provide some information during interrogation. Soviet female fighters usually broke faster than men, especially after several days without food and sleep. He was already calculating the route back to the unit's location, thinking about a hot dinner and a glass of schnapps. At that moment, One of the soldiers standing closest to the girl met her gaze, and something in that look made his instincts roar an alarm signal. The prisoner's eyes suddenly ceased to be extinguished and lifeless. A cold, calculating gleam of a professional assessing distance and angles of attack appeared in them. The soldier opened his mouth to shout a warning to his comrades, but the sound stuck in his throat. It was already too late. Potemkina's body seemed to explode from within, with energy that she had been storing while pretending to be weak and exhausted. The girl who a second ago could barely stand on her feet transformed into an instrument of vengeance against the occupiers. To understand what actually happened in that forest in the autumn of 1943, we need to go back 3 years, to the year 1940, when Svetlana Potemkina first crossed the threshold of the sports hall at the Moscow Institute of Physical Culture. Back then, no one could have imagined that this short girl with an ordinary Slavic face would become a living legend of Soviet military intelligence. Then she was simply one of hundreds of female students passionate about sports and physical improvement. Potemkina was born in 1921 in Tula, in the family of an arms factory worker. Her childhood passed in a typical Soviet atmosphere: school, pioneer organization, Komsomol. Nothing foreshadowed a military career. The girl was keen on gymnastics, showed decent results in track and field, and dreamed of becoming a physical education teacher. But fate was preparing a completely different path for her. At the institute, Svetlana ended up in a hand-to-hand combat section led by Valentin Nalivaika, one of the creators of the weaponless self-defense system for the Red Army. This man had developed a unique combat methodology that combined elements of various martial arts with practical experience from real confrontations. Nalivaika was looking for talented students capable not just of memorizing techniques, but of understanding the philosophy of combat, feeling the opponent and instantly adapting to changing situations. Potemkina turned out to be exactly such a student. Her natural abilities, namely quick reaction, flexibility, and coordination of movement, were complemented by a phenomenal capacity for learning. She grasped new techniques literally on the fly, memorized combinations after 2 or 3 repetitions, intuitively understood the mechanics of the human body and the opponent's weak points. Nalivaika noticed her after just a month of training and began paying special attention to developing her skills. The training was exhausting. 6 days a week, 4 to 5 hours daily, practicing strikes on bags until the joints began to ache with pain, sparring with men who exceeded her in weight and strength, studying human anatomy to know exactly where to strike to instantly incapacitate an opponent, psychological preparation that taught suppressing fear and pain and maintaining clarity of thought in critical situations. Potemkina absorbed all this like a sponge, transforming from an ordinary athlete into a real combat weapon. By 1939, when the war with Finland began, Potemkina was already considered one of Valentin Nalivaika's best students. She could confront 3 or 4 men simultaneously, using their strength against themselves. Her signature technique was turning any attempt at capture into a counterattack. She learned to instantly redirect the energy of an opponent's attack to her advantage, using the laws of physics and body mechanics. What distinguished her from other students was not just technical mastery, but an almost mystical ability to read the opponent's intentions. She saw micro-movements of muscles before the strike was delivered, caught changes in breathing rhythm, noticed the slightest shift in body weight. This sixth sense, combined with years of training, made her nearly invincible in close combat. The instructors at the institute began using her as a demonstration example during lessons. Young male cadets watched in amazement as this fragile girl threw opponents twice her weight, neutralized attacks they couldn't even see, turned the aggressor's strength into his own downfall. But behind the external ease lay years of brutal work. Potemkina's hands were covered with calluses. Her knuckles were deformed from thousands of strikes. Her body bore scars from unsuccessful sparring sessions. She learned to fall so as not to break bones, learned to strike so as to stop the heart or paralyze the nervous system. She studied pain points on the human body with the precision of a surgeon. Her training diary, which she kept meticulously, contained detailed descriptions of each technique, analysis of mistakes, plans for improvement. She trained even when others rested, worked through combinations in her mind before sleep, visualized fights with imaginary opponents. This obsession with perfection sometimes frightened even her instructor. Nalivaika saw in her not just a talented student, but something more. A warrior born in the wrong era. Someone who should have lived in times when personal combat mastery decided the outcome of battles. He understood that war was inevitable, and that Potemkina's skills would soon be needed not on sports mats, but on real battlefields. In 1940, when the Institute organized demonstration performances, Potemkina performed a number that made even experienced military men catch their breath. She faced 5 male students armed with training knives. Within 3 minutes, all 5 were on the floor, disarmed and neutralized. She didn't have a single scratch. The hall erupted in applause, but Svetlana remained calm. For her, this wasn't a show, but a test of readiness. After the performance, several officers from military intelligence approached Nalivaika. They asked detailed questions about the training methodology, about Potemkina's capabilities, about the possibility of using such skills in special operations. The instructor understood that his best student was attracting attention from those who would soon need her talents. The pre-war months passed in intensive training. Potemkina continued to improve, but now with a clear understanding that her skills might soon be tested in real combat. She studied not just techniques, but tactics of survival in extreme conditions. How to move silently, how to remain invisible, how to kill quickly and quietly. Nalivaika introduced her to veterans of the Civil War, people who knew what real combat meant, not sports sparring. They told her about the psychological aspect of killing, about how the first enemy you kill changes you forever, about how important it is not to let emotions cloud your judgment in battle. She listened carefully, memorized, tried to prepare herself for what she had never experienced. In the spring of 1941, several months before the war began, Potemkina received an invitation to special training courses. She didn't know it then, but this was her recruitment into military intelligence structures. The courses were held at a classified facility outside Moscow. There she met people like herself, men and women with unique skills who were being prepared for special operations. They studied German language, learned to recognize enemy uniforms and insignia, practiced radio operation and explosive techniques. But the main focus remained on hand-to-hand combat and silent elimination of sentries. Potemkina discovered that her skills, honed in the sports hall, needed to be adapted for real combat conditions. Sports sparring and combat to the death were two different things. She learned to strike not to earn points, but to kill. She learned to use any object as a weapon: a belt, a stick, a stone. Even bare hands could become lethal instruments. The instructors were impressed by her speed of learning and absolute absence of squeamishness. While other female students hesitated before practicing on mannequins simulating human bodies, Potemkina worked with cold efficiency. She understood that hesitation in real combat would mean death. When on the 22nd of June, 1941, war began, Svetlana Potemkina was ready. Not just physically, but psychologically. She knew what she would have to do, understood the price she would have to pay. While thousands of young people stormed military registration offices, not knowing what awaited them, Potemkina already had a clear understanding of her role in this war. She would go behind enemy lines. She would kill. She would risk her life with each mission. And she was ready for it. The student who 3 years ago dreamed of becoming a physical education teacher had transformed into one of the most dangerous weapons the Red Army possessed. A weapon that looked like a fragile, harmless girl, but could kill 6 armed soldiers with her bare hands. The war that began on the 22nd of June, 1941, shattered millions of destinies in a matter of hours. While German tanks rolled across Soviet territory and Luftwaffe bombers turned cities into ruins, Svetlana Potemkina received orders to report to a classified address in Moscow. The building stood on a quiet street, unremarkable from the outside. But inside operated one of the most secretive divisions of military intelligence. Major Leontiev, a legend among reconnaissance officers, personally interviewed each candidate for his unit. A man of about 40 with a scarred face and piercing gaze that seemed to see right through people. He had spent years working behind enemy lines, knew German like his native language, and could recognize an enemy agent by the slightest behavioral nuance. When Potemkina entered his office, Leontiev studied her in silence for a long minute. A fragile girl, unremarkable appearance, nothing that would suggest a dangerous fighter. Exactly what was needed for intelligence work. Those who looked like heroes died first. Survivors were those who could blend into a crowd, become invisible, strike when no one expected it. Leontiev asked just one question. Was she ready to kill? Not in self-defense, not in a fair fight, but to kill from behind, silently, without warning. To kill and feel nothing, because the mission was more important than any moral doubts. Potemkina answered without hesitation. Yes, she was ready. Something in her voice, in her eyes, convinced the major that this girl was not lying. The selection for Leontiev's unit was brutal. Out of 100 candidates, only 1 passed. They were tested for physical endurance, psychological stability, ability to withstand pain and fear. They were deprived of sleep, starved, subjected to mock interrogations with torture elements. Many broke in the first days. Potemkina endured everything without a single complaint. When during one of the tests she was given the task of killing a German prisoner who refused to cooperate, she did it without hesitation. A quick strike to the neck, broken vertebrae, instant death. The instructors exchanged glances. This girl had ice in her veins. By autumn of 1941, when German troops were approaching Moscow, Potemkina completed her training and was included in an operational group preparing for deployment behind enemy lines. The reconnaissance school where final preparations took place was located in a forest outside Moscow. Here, future scouts studied in conditions as close to real combat as possible. They learned to move silently through forests, avoid ambushes, read tracks and signs. They studied German military documents, memorized the structure of Wehrmacht units, learned to distinguish ranks and insignia. Radio operators practiced coded transmissions. Demolition experts learned to make explosives from improvised materials. But the most important skill was survival. How to find food in the forest, how to treat wounds without medical supplies, how to withstand interrogation and torture if captured. The instructors, veterans of the Spanish Civil War and conflicts in the Far East, didn't coddle the students. They knew that sentimentality killed in this profession. Potemkina's first operation was scheduled for December of 1941. The coldest winter in decades, temperatures dropping to -30, deep snow making movement nearly impossible. Her group of 5 people was to cross the front line, penetrate German rear areas near Moscow, conduct reconnaissance of enemy positions, and return with information. The group leader was an experienced scout named Volkov, a man of few words who had already completed a dozen missions behind enemy lines. 2 radio operators, a demolition expert, and Potemkina as a combat specialist. They crossed the line at night through a section of forest where the front was relatively thin. German sentries were warming themselves by fires, not expecting anyone to move in such cold. The group moved in single file, maintaining a distance of 10 meters between each person. Potemkina walked second, right behind Volkov. The frost was so severe that breath froze instantly, covering faces with a crust of ice. Her fingers and mittens were going numb, despite constant movement. But she couldn't allow herself to think about the cold. Any distraction could be fatal. They walked for 6 hours before stumbling upon a German patrol. 3 soldiers appeared on the forest path ahead, moving in their direction. There was nowhere to hide. The snow around was deep. Any attempt to run would make noise. Volkov made a quick hand signal. Eliminate silently. Potemkina understood immediately. This was her first real combat, not training, not exercises. Real people who would try to kill her if given the chance. The Germans hadn't noticed them yet, talking among themselves, probably complaining about the cold and guard duty. Volkov and Potemkina separated, approaching from different sides. The distance closed to 20 meters, 15, 10. One of the Germans finally saw movement, began to raise his rifle. But it was too late. Potemkina covered the final meters in 3 leaps. Her body remembered thousands of hours of training. Muscles acted automatically. The first German didn't even have time to shout. A strike to the throat crushed larynx. He fell silently into the snow. The second turned around, tried to bring his weapon to bear. Potemkina grabbed the rifle barrel, jerked it aside. The shot went into the air. A knee to the groin, the enemy bent over. An elbow to the back of the head. He collapsed. The third German managed to fire a burst from his submachine gun, but the shots went wide. Volkov took him down with a knife. Everything lasted less than 30 seconds. 3 bodies in the snow. Steam rising from fresh wounds. Potemkina stood over the first German she had killed, breathing heavily, adrenaline pounding in her temples. The man's face, frozen in surprise and pain, would haunt her dreams for months. But there was no time for reflection. They had to move. The shots would attract attention. The group quickly searched the bodies, took documents and ammunition, moved deeper into the forest. Over the next 3 days, they conducted reconnaissance of German positions, recorded the location of artillery batteries, ammunition depots, command posts. The radio operator transmitted the information to the center. Then came the return. They were discovered when crossing back through the front line. A German machine gun opened fire, bullets tearing through the snow around them. The demolition expert was killed immediately. A burst caught him in the back. One of the radio operators was wounded in the leg. Volkov made the decision to split up. He and Potemkina would draw fire while the others broke through. They ran through the forest, German voices shouting behind them, bullets whistling past. Potemkina felt something hot graze her shoulder, tore through her jacket, but no pain. They burst into a ravine, rolled down the slope, the Germans above them firing blindly. At the bottom of the ravine, they lay pressed against the ground, trying not to breathe. The Germans didn't come down, apparently deciding not to risk it in the darkness. They made it back to their lines by morning. The wounded radio operator and the surviving member of the group had also made it. Out of 5, 4 returned. Not a bad result for a first mission. At the debriefing, Leontiev listened to the report, studied the documents they had captured, nodded with satisfaction. The information was valuable, The mission successful. He looked at Potemkina with new respect. The girl had passed her baptism of fire, killed her first enemies, didn't panic under fire. She would do. Over the next months, Potemkina went on mission after mission. Winter of 1941 and 42. Spring, summer. Each operation made her more experienced, more cold-blooded, more dangerous. She learned to kill in dozens of ways, with weapons and without, quickly and slowly, loudly and silently. She learned to suppress empathy, to see enemies not as people, but as targets. The psychological cost was enormous. After each mission, she returned changed. The faces of those she killed appeared in dreams. The demolition expert who died on the first mission, she saw him in every forest shadow. Other fighters in the unit noticed that Potemkina had stopped smiling, stopped talking about anything except work. She became a perfect instrument of war, but ceased to be fully human. Leontiev saw this and worried. Such fighters burned out quickly, lost the edge that kept them alive. But the war demanded sacrifices, and Potemkina was too valuable to be pulled from operations. By the end of 1942, she had completed 23 missions behind enemy lines. Her survival rate was phenomenal in a unit where the average fighter lasted through 12 operations before being killed or captured. She developed her own style of work. While male scouts relied on strength and aggression, Potemkina used cunning and patience. She could lie in ambush for hours, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She never took unnecessary risks, always calculated escape routes, never let emotions dictate decisions. Her specialty became solo operations where a woman aroused less suspicion than a man. She could pose as a refugee, a peasant woman, a worker at a German facility. Her knowledge of German was decent enough to maintain a simple conversation. And when the moment came for action, she struck with the speed and precision of a viper. Enemy counterintelligence began noting the appearance of a dangerous Soviet agent in their reports. A woman who left no witnesses, who disappeared like smoke. They tried to hunt her, set traps, but Potemkina always sensed danger. Her instincts, honed by combat experience, never failed her. By 1943, the war had entered a new phase. The Red Army, having broken the enemy at Stalingrad, was gradually pushing the Germans westward, but victory still seemed distant, and the work of reconnaissance units became even more important. Leontiev's unit operated on the occupied territories of Ukraine and Belarus, areas where the front line was fluid and German rear services were stretched thin. Potemkina, by this time, had become one of the most valued fighters in the unit. Over 50 operations behind her, a record that seemed impossible. Commanders tried to include her in the most complex assignments, those where success depended on surgical precision and nerves of steel. The specificity of a female reconnaissance agent gave her advantages that male fighters didn't have. A woman aroused less suspicion, could move more freely through occupied territories, had easier access to certain types of information. Potemkina developed several cover legends that she used depending on the situation. Most often she posed as a displaced person, a refugee fleeing from the front. Her documents, masterfully forged by unit specialists, indicated that she was from a village destroyed by fighting. Such people were tens of thousands, and German occupation authorities paid them little attention. Another frequent role was that of a worker at German facilities. She could get hired as a cleaning woman, a kitchen assistant, a laundress. Work that made her invisible, allowed her to move around military installations, observe, memorize, transmit information. But behind the external simplicity of these roles lay enormous tension. One mistake, one wrong word, one suspicious gesture could mean exposure and death. German counterintelligence was not stupid. They knew that Soviet reconnaissance used women, knew their methods, constantly improved security measures. Potemkina had to be constantly on guard, never relax, never allow herself to be herself. She lived under cover for weeks, sometimes months, playing her role so convincingly that she herself sometimes forgot who she really was. The psychological strain was colossal. She had to smile at Germans who killed her people, serve them food, wash their clothes, pretend to be grateful for work and rations. And all this time, to remember, to observe, to search for opportunities to strike. One of her most successful operations took place in the spring of 1943 in Minsk. German command was preparing a major offensive, and Soviet intelligence needed to know the exact plans. Potemkina was inserted into the city under the guise of a woman whose husband had been killed and who was looking for any work to survive. She managed to get hired as a cleaning woman in a building where an Abwehr officer was quartered. A methodical, cautious man who kept important documents in his apartment. For 3 weeks, Potemkina cleaned his rooms, washed floors, changed linens. The officer barely noticed her, as people rarely notice servants. She studied his habits, learned when he left, when he returned, where he kept keys, how the lock on his safe worked. One evening, when the officer left for a meeting at headquarters, Potemkina had 3 hours. She picked the safe lock, a skill she had learned during training. Inside were folders with documents, maps, orders. She couldn't take anything that would immediately reveal the theft. But she had a miniature camera, another miracle of intelligence technology. She photographed each page, working quickly but carefully, making sure not to leave traces. 2 hours later, everything was back in place, the safe locked, no sign that anyone had been there. The photographs, hidden in a special compartment sewn into her clothes, she passed to a contact the next day. The information proved invaluable. Soviet command learned about German plans in time to prepare a defense that thwarted the offensive. But not all operations ended successfully. In the summer of 1943, Potemkina participated in a mission to eliminate a high-ranking SS officer who was organizing punitive operations against partisans. The group of 3 agents infiltrated the town where the officer was stationed. The plan was simple: intercept him on the road between his headquarters and his residence. Eliminate him, disappear. But someone betrayed them. When they set up the ambush, instead of one car with the officer, a convoy of 3 vehicles appeared, full of armed soldiers. It was a trap. A firefight erupted. One agent was killed immediately, the second was wounded. Potemkina covered their retreat, firing a captured submachine gun, then disappeared into the forest when ammunition ran out. She spent 2 weeks making her way back to Soviet lines. 2 weeks of constant pursuit, hunger, exhaustion. German patrols combed the forests. Local collaborators were promised rewards for information about Soviet agents. Potemkina moved only at night, hid during the day, ate berries and roots, drank from streams. Her uniform was torn to shreds, her body covered in scratches and bruises. But she survived, made it back, reported on the failed operation. Leontiev listened to her report, nodded grimly. Such was war. Not all missions succeeded, not all fighters returned. The important thing was that Potemkina had survived, would fight another day. The wounded agent also made it back. The one who died remained in an unmarked grave somewhere in a Belarusian forest. These failures, though rare, took their toll. Potemkina began to understand that luck wouldn't last forever. Statistics were merciless. The more operations you completed, the higher the probability that the next one would be your last. She saw comrades die. Experienced fighters who had survived dozens of missions, killed by a random bullet or betrayed by an informant. She attended memorial services where empty chairs stood for those who would never return. And each time she wondered if her chair would be next. But she couldn't stop. The war continued, intelligence was needed, and she was too valuable a specialist to be pulled from operations. Leontiev tried to give her breaks between missions, but Potemkina often refused. Inactivity was worse than danger. When she wasn't working, memories came. Faces of the dead, doubts about the meaning of it all. By the autumn of 1943, when the events described at the beginning of this story took place, Potemkina had accumulated enormous combat experience. She knew enemy tactics, could predict their actions, sensed danger at an intuitive level. Her reputation in the unit was legendary. New fighters listened with awe to stories about her operations, about how she penetrated impregnable facilities, eliminated important targets, escaped from seemingly hopeless situations. But Potemkina herself didn't feel like a hero. She felt tired, empty, like a mechanism that continued to function only because it knew no other way. The war had changed her beyond recognition. The girl who 3 years ago dreamed of becoming a physical education teacher no longer existed. In her place was a killer, cold, efficient, deadly. The methods she had developed through experience became the basis for training other female reconnaissance agents. By 1943, Leontiev's unit included 8 women fighters, each with her own specialization. They studied Potemkina's techniques, learned from her mistakes, adopted her methods. Particular attention was paid to hand-to-hand combat adapted for women. Not strength techniques, but methods using the opponent's weaknesses against himself. They learned to act against physically stronger men using speed, precision, and knowledge of vulnerable points on the human body. Many techniques that Potemkina had developed or adapted entered official self-defense manuals that would be used for decades after the war. German counterintelligence quickly realized the threat posed by Soviet female agents. Special instructions for their identification and detention appeared in Abwehr reports. The Germans noted that female saboteurs acted with particular caution, were harder to detect, and more often successfully escaped from critical situations. There were cases when entire German units were raised on alert to capture a single female scout. Lists of wanted persons included detailed descriptions, photographs obtained from informants, information about methods of operation. Potemkina's name, though under various aliases, appeared in these documents repeatedly. The Germans knew there was a highly dangerous agent operating in the region, but couldn't catch her. She was too careful, too experienced, too skilled at disappearing. The mission that led to the encounter in the autumn forest was supposed to be routine. Potemkina was to cross enemy lines, conduct reconnaissance of German communications in preparation for a major offensive, then return. A standard assignment she had completed dozens of times before. But war is unpredictable. The group she was with was discovered while crossing, scattered under fire. Potemkina found herself alone, separated from her comrades, deep in enemy territory, with limited supplies and no radio contact. She decided to make her way back independently, moving through forests, avoiding roads and populated areas. For 3 days she walked, carefully bypassing German patrols, surviving on what she could find. On the 4th day, exhausted but still alert, she encountered a German patrol in the forest. 6 soldiers who thought they had found an easy prisoner. They had no idea they were about to make the last mistake of their lives. The moment of explosion arrived with the inevitability of a lightning strike. Potemkina's body, which a second ago had seemed on the verge of collapse, transformed into concentrated, lethal force. The transformation was so sudden, so complete, that the German soldiers' brains couldn't process what was happening. Their perception lagged behind reality. And in combat, even a fraction of a second delay meant death. The first soldier, the one who had extended his hand to search her, never understood what hit him. Potemkina's palm, edge rigid as steel, struck his solar plexus with surgical precision. The blow collapsed his diaphragm, expelled all air from his lungs, sent a shockwave through his nervous system. He folded in half, mouth gaping like a fish pulled from water, unable to draw breath. Before he hit the ground, Potemkina was already moving to the next target. The second soldier, the one holding the submachine gun, managed to register movement in his peripheral vision. His finger began squeezing the trigger. But the weapon was pointed at the ground, and raising it would take precious milliseconds he didn't have. Potemkina's hand shot out, grabbed his wrist, twisted with a motion that used his own body weight against him. The joint hyperextended, ligaments tore, bone cracked. The submachine gun fell from nerveless fingers. She continued the motion, pulling him off balance, her leg hooking behind his knee. He went down hard, his head striking a tree root with a sickening thud that ensured he wouldn't be getting up. 3 seconds had elapsed. 2 Germans down. 4 remained, and they were starting to react. The patrol commander's mind finally caught up with events. His hand flew to his holster, fingers fumbling with the leather flap covering his pistol. He opened his mouth to shout orders, but his voice came out as a strangled croak. Fear had seized his throat, the primal terror of prey suddenly realizing it faces a predator. The other 3 soldiers were raising their weapons, but they were clustered too close together, hampered by their own numbers. Potemkina had positioned herself so that the falling bodies of the first 2 Germans obscured the line of fire. She dropped low, scooped up the fallen submachine gun with one hand, her fingers finding the trigger guard with practiced ease. The weapon came up, barrel tracking across targets with fluid precision. She didn't aim in the conventional sense. Thousands of hours of training had embedded the geometry of violence into her muscle memory. Her body knew angles, understood trajectories, calculated lead time without conscious thought. The submachine gun barked, a short burst of 3 rounds. The nearest soldier took all 3 in the chest, his body armor from that era useless against point-blank fire. He spun and fell. Potemkina was already rolling, the motion taking her behind a thick birch tree as return fire finally came. Bullets chewed bark from the tree trunk, splinters flying like wooden shrapnel. She counted the shots, estimated ammunition expenditure, calculated reload times. Her mind operated with cold mathematical precision, emotions locked away in a place they couldn't interfere with survival. The remaining 3 Germans were spreading out now, trying to establish a crossfire. They were experienced soldiers, not stupid, and the initial shock was wearing off. They communicated with hand signals, began flanking movements. Potemkina recognized professional tactics when she saw them. These men had fought on the Eastern Front, had survived battles that killed millions. They wouldn't be easy prey. But she had one crucial advantage. They still thought of her as primarily a target to be killed. She thought of them as problems to be solved, and she had been solving such problems for 3 years. The submachine gun in her hands clicked empty, out of ammunition. She didn't waste time trying to find a magazine on the fallen soldier. Instead, she reversed the weapon, gripping it by the barrel, turning it into a club. 1 German was circling left, another right, the third providing covering fire. Standard small unit tactics. Potemkina waited, counting heartbeats, watching the pattern of their movement. The soldier on the left was slightly ahead, eager, probably younger. Youth made you careless. He rounded the tree, weapon raised, expecting to find her crouched and cornered. Instead, she exploded toward him, inside the arc of his rifle before he could bring it to bear. The submachine gun swung in a flat arc, caught him across the temple. Skull fractured, he went down like a puppet with cut strings. She kept moving, using the momentum, knowing the other two would be converging on the sound. The German on the right appeared, saw his comrade falling, swung his weapon toward Potemkina. But she was no longer where he expected. She had dropped below his sight line, was rolling across the forest floor, closing distance. His shots went high, tearing through empty air where her head had been. She came up inside his guard, one hand deflecting the rifle barrel, the other striking his throat. Not hard enough to kill, but enough to close his windpipe, make him forget about shooting as he clawed at his neck, desperate for air. A knee to his groin doubled him over. An elbow to the back of his skull sent him into darkness. That left one. The patrol commander. He stood 15 meters away, pistol finely drawn, both hands wrapped around the grip, arms extended in a proper shooting stance. For a moment, they stared at each other across the blood-soaked clearing. He was older, maybe 40, with the Iron Cross ribbon on his tunic. A veteran, someone who had probably fought in the First War as well. His hands were steady, his eyes cold. He knew what she was, understood that he was looking at death in human form. But he was a German soldier, and German soldiers didn't surrender, didn't run. His finger tightened on the trigger. Potemkina moved the instant she saw the muscle tension in his hand. The pistol discharged. The bullet passed through the space where she had been standing, buried itself in a tree trunk. She was already diving forward, closing the distance with desperate speed. His second shot was closer, plucked at her sleeve, burned a line across her forearm. The third missed because she was too close, inside the pistol's effective range, and he was backpedaling, trying to maintain distance. But retreating while shooting accurately is difficult, and fear was finally breaking through his professional calm. His fourth shot went wild. Then she was on him, one hand clamping around his wrist, forcing the pistol up and away. Her other hand drove into his ribs, once, twice, 3 times. Rapid strikes that cracked bone and pulped internal organs. He tried to headbutt her, but she twisted aside. Let his momentum carry him forward and down. As he fell, she wrenched the pistol from his grip, reversed it, brought the grip down on the base of his skull. He collapsed face first into the dead leaves and didn't move. Silence descended on the forest, broken only by Potemkina's harsh breathing and the wet gasping of the soldier with the crushed throat. She stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded by 6 bodies in various states of incapacity. Blood spattered her uniform, her face, her hands. Some of it was hers, most wasn't. Her left arm burned where the bullet had grazed her, but the wound was superficial. She checked each German methodically, ensuring none posed a threat. 2 were dead, 1 dying, 3 unconscious, and likely to stay that way for hours. She collected their documents, anything that might contain intelligence value. Maps, orders, identification papers. She took ammunition, a better weapon, a canteen of water, some bread from 1 soldier's pack. The entire engagement had lasted perhaps 6 minutes from start to finish. 6 minutes of violence so intense that her hands were shaking now from adrenaline crash. But she couldn't afford to rest. Gunfire would attract attention. German reinforcements might already be responding. She needed to move, put distance between herself and this place. Before leaving, she looked once more at the patrol commander, still breathing shallowly into the forest floor. A soldier doing his duty, just as she was doing hers. In another life, they might have passed each other on a street, strangers with no reason for enmity. But war had made them enemies, and war had decided which of them would walk away. She felt nothing looking at him. Not triumph, not guilt, not satisfaction. Only the hollow emptiness that came after killing, the emotional void that protected her sanity. Potemkina turned and vanished into the forest, moving quickly and quietly, leaving behind 6 Germans who had made the fatal mistake of underestimating their opponent. The autumn wind stirred the leaves, covering her tracks, carrying away the sounds and smells of combat. Nature, indifferent to human violence, continued its eternal cycle. And somewhere in Moscow, in a classified office, Major Leontiev would eventually receive a report about a reconnaissance agent who had completed yet another impossible mission and returned alive. Just another entry in a classified file, another operation in a secret war that would never appear in official histories. Potemkina made it back to Soviet lines 3 days after the encounter in the forest. She crossed during a moonless night, crawling through a minefield, using techniques learned in training to probe for mines with a knife blade. The sentries on the Soviet side nearly shot her before she identified herself with the proper password. They stared at this apparition covered in mud and dried blood, barely recognizable as human, let alone as a woman. She reported directly to Leontiev, presented the documents taken from the German patrol. Among them were deployment orders that revealed enemy troop concentrations, information valuable enough to influence tactical decisions. The major listened to her report, noted the successful completion of her mission, observed the fresh scar on her arm. He said nothing about the 6 Germans. Such details didn't need to be spoken. The results mattered, not the methods. This was Operation Number 71. By the spring of 1944, Potemkina had become a legend within the intelligence community, though her name remained classified. Stories circulated among reconnaissance units about the woman who always returned, who could kill with her bare hands, who walked through German-occupied territory like a ghost. But legends took their toll on the person living them. After Operation 70, Leontiev made a decision. He ordered Potemkina to take mandatory leave, a full month at a military sanatorium outside Moscow. She protested, insisted she was fine, ready for the next mission. He refused to listen. He had seen too many fighters burn out, lose the edge that kept them alive, make fatal mistakes born from exhaustion. The sanatorium felt surreal after years of constant danger. Clean sheets, regular meals, doctors who examined her injuries and prescribed rest. Other patients, mostly wounded officers recovering from physical trauma, gave her space. They sensed something in her, a coiled tension that never fully relaxed, eyes that constantly scanned for threats even in the safety of the facility. She couldn't sleep without nightmares. Faces of the dead appeared in her dreams, German and Soviet alike, asking questions she couldn't answer. Why them and not her? What made her survival more valuable than theirs? She had no answers. During the day, she walked the grounds, practiced her combat forms in private, kept her skills sharp because she knew the war wasn't finished with her yet. When she returned to the unit in May, preparation for Operation Bagration was underway. The massive offensive that would liberate Belarus required extensive reconnaissance. Leontiev's unit would deploy multiple teams behind enemy lines to gather intelligence on German fortifications, supply lines, and troop movements. Potemkina was assigned to lead a small group, her experience making her qualified for independent command. The operation was her 87th. 87 times she had crossed into enemy territory. 87 times she had risked capture, torture, death. The statistics were impossible. The average reconnaissance agent in Leontiev's unit survived 12 operations. She had exceeded that number by a factor of 7. Luck alone couldn't explain it. Skill, yes. Experience, certainly. But also something else. Perhaps a quality that couldn't be quantified? An instinct for survival that transcended training. The war ground on through 1944 and into 45. Potemkina continued working, mission after mission, as Soviet forces pushed westward. She was present during the liberation of Minsk, operated in Poland, crossed into Germany itself in the final months. By May of 1945, when Germany surrendered, she had completed 87 operations behind enemy lines. Of the 140 fighters who had served in Leontiev's unit during the war, only 32 survived to see victory. She was among them, decorated with medals, her uniform jacket heavy with honors. But the awards felt meaningless. They were tokens, symbols that couldn't capture the reality of what had been endured and lost. The broader context of her story encompassed a phenomenon unique in military history. 800,000 women had served in the Red Army during the Great Patriotic War. They worked as medics, radio operators, anti-aircraft gunners, snipers, pilots, tank crews, and yes, reconnaissance agents. The Soviet Union was the only nation that employed women in direct combat roles on such a massive scale. 89 women received the title Hero of the Soviet Union. 9 were named Heroes of Russia. 4 became full Cavaliers of the Order of Glory. These numbers represented extraordinary individual courage, but also desperate necessity. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people in the war. Women had to fill roles traditionally reserved for men because there weren't enough men left. Potemkina's success had broader implications for military policy. Before 1942, command was skeptical about using women in reconnaissance and sabotage operations. Prevailing attitudes held that women were physically weaker, psychologically less stable, unable to endure the hardships of work behind enemy lines. Her experience, and that of other female agents, demolished these prejudices. By the end of the war, 8 women served in Leontiev's unit, each having completed dozens of operations. They proved that proper training and natural talent mattered more than physical strength. The techniques Potemkina had developed, methods that used an opponent's weaknesses against him rather than relying on superior force, became foundational in special operations training. Her legacy extended far beyond her individual missions. After the war, Potemkina didn't immediately return to civilian life. She continued serving in intelligence organs, training the next generation of operatives. She worked as an instructor at a classified facility where reconnaissance agents were prepared for potential future conflicts. Her courses on hand-to-hand combat, survival techniques, and operational security became mandatory curriculum. Students listened in awe as this woman, who looked so ordinary, demonstrated techniques that could kill in seconds. She was patient with students, demanding but fair, and absolutely uncompromising about standards. Lives depended on proper training, and she wouldn't pass anyone who wasn't ready. She had seen too many die because they weren't adequately prepared. Only in the early 1950s did she finally demobilize and attempt to return to civilian life. But the transition proved nearly impossible. War had changed her in ways that couldn't be undone. She couldn't sleep in darkness without nightmares, flinched at sudden sounds, constantly evaluated everyone around her as potential threats. These were symptoms of what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, though in that era, no such diagnosis existed. Veterans were expected to simply readjust, move on, not burden society with their trauma. Potemkina tried. She found work teaching physical education, the career she had once dreamed of before the war. But the innocence required for that dream was long gone, burned away in the fires of combat. Her story became publicly known only years after the war, when classification restrictions on Leontiev's unit were partially lifted. Journalists wrote articles. Books were published. Her exploits entered the historical record. But the real Svetlana Potemkina remained elusive, hidden behind the legend. She rarely gave interviews, disliked public attention, preferred to live quietly. When she did speak about the war, she talked not about her own achievements, but about comrades who hadn't returned, about the cost of victory, about the necessity of remembering. She represented an entire generation of Soviet women who, in a critical historical moment, took on burdens traditionally assigned to men and carried them with honor. The encounter in the autumn forest of 1943 became symbolic of her entire experience. 6 armed soldiers versus 1 woman, the outcome preordained in their minds, reversed by skill and determination. That story illustrated a broader truth, that courage and capability transcend physical limitations, that proper preparation can overcome superior force, that the spirit of resistance cannot be broken by occupation or superior numbers. Potemkina's main legacy wasn't the medals or the honors. It was the proof that human potential, when properly developed and directed, can achieve what seems impossible. She showed that a fragile-looking woman could be more dangerous than a squad of soldiers, that training and will could defeat strength and weapons, that in the critical moment, any person is capable of extraordinary acts if they find the courage to stand and fight. Her story became part of the larger narrative of Soviet women in the war. 800,000 individuals who proved that defending the homeland was not exclusively a male responsibility, that valor and sacrifice recognized no gender boundaries. Thank you for watching this story to the end. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It's very important for continuing work on similar materials. Goodbye.